Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this video for the Machine Quilting Party. Today we're quilting straight lines in this Prism Path baby quilt. This is such a simple design. You can quilt with walking foot style quilting, and the only tricky thing here is I'm going to be changing thread color a lot. I want to change thread color through every color of my prism. So I'm matching thread with those beautiful rainbow colors. So that's really the only tricky thing. This is really going to be a very simple quilting design. It's going to cover the quilt with beautiful texture, and it's going to go hopefully pretty quickly. So let's jump on the machine and learn how to quilt straight lines together. Now a little prep just to get us started. I have pulled out all of the thread colors that I'm going to be using in this quilt because I'm going to match all of these colors through the prism and match them pretty closely. This is what I usually don't do. I don't usually blend the color of the thread just absolutely perfectly with the fabric because I like it to stand out a little bit. But for this quilt, I really feel like the focus is the prism, is the fabrics making that design. So I think that the thread needs to take a back seat, and that's why I picked these colors so that they would blend rather than contrast. And you can find these particular colors of Isocord thread. We have a special kit with all of the colors that we're using this year as we explore walking foot quilting. Now the color I'm going to use the most of is white, and I'm going to be using that in the black background here. I know that's going to be a really strong contrast, but that's intentional for me because I want you to see what I'm doing and how I'm stitching and what my thread looks like and my stitches look like on the surface. But of course, if you wanted less contrast, then gray or black, any of those colors will work just fine. Or if you are doing the version of the quilt that's in the book, that's obviously a cream background, so white would actually be the right choice. So it's totally up to you as far as the thread goes. You could pick one color for these straight lines. You could do white over the entire quilt, and that would look good too. I just kind of like when I know the piecing needs to be the dominant thing. I kind of like to match in that situation. And also another side thing is, you know, these are straight lines. I know where I'm going. I don't really need to see what I'm doing as I stitch that. So that's my choice, and that's how I prepped up my bobbins. Now real quick, a tool that I use in my bobbin case, and I keep this in all the time. I never take it out. It's a magic bobbin washer. Basically, this is just a little Teflon disc that goes inside the bobbin case. Then you take your bobbin, put it in, and wind it just like normal. And this works for both side-loading bobbins like mine is and top-loading bobbins. It doesn't matter what type you've got, but this is really helpful for older machines that might just have a little extra space in the case, and that allows the bobbin to kind of rattle around a little bit. That can affect your tension. So having that bobbin washer inside is really helpful. Now, if you happen to have a little pigtail on your bobbin case like mine and it has a hole in it, consider threading that hole. Just try it and see what happens. You might have to adjust the tension down on your bobbin case ever so slightly, but I find that this brings the thread up just a little closer to the needle, and it just feeds just that little bit better. So it might be something to try if you've never tried it before. So that's the prep that I did. I got all of my threads wound on bobbins. I went on ahead and wound 3 bobbins of white thread just so I wouldn't run out. And this is just nice so that way you don't have to stop in the middle of the quilt and have to stop and wind bobbins. You can just pop from one thread color to the next, and that's going to make it a lot faster. So now that we've got our thread ready to go, let's jump on the machine and start quilting these straight lines. So I'm here on the machine, and a few tools that I'm using. I always wear quilting gloves. It just helps me get a good grip on the quilt so I can move it easily. And I have a queen size Supreme slider here positioned to the left side of the foot. And this is just a grippy Teflon sheet, and it's real slippery on the surface, and that's going to help the quilt glide and slide really easily. Now you don't want to cover up the feed dogs when you're walking foot quilting, so I have it positioned here to the left. And that way the feed dogs can be working, the walking foot can be working, all that will be good. Now some settings I've set up. I have set my needle to be in the down position, and my stitch length is set to 1.5 millimeters. And that's just going to produce a nice, tight, consistent stitch. Okay, so let's feed the quilt into the arm of the machine. And this is just a little tricky. You just got to navigate all of these pens and pen moors. Just watch out for them. And we're aiming for the middle of the quilt. And I've just decided to begin stitching somewhere in the middle of this red section. And I've got red thread wound up on my machine. I have that threaded through the top and in the bobbin. Yes, I am going to have red thread on this backing fabric. That's okay. I believe in using the same color thread on the top and in the bobbin of the machine. So that's the rule I always use. And it's just going to result in a much more beautiful stitch, more balanced stitch. I'm not going to have any dots of the wrong color flipping to either side of the quilt. So all of that's good stuff. Okay, so I drop my needle down. I'm going to use the hand wheel, just rotating the hand wheel to bring it back up again, and to the point that the needle starts to drop back down into the machine. And at that point, I know it's made a full rotation through the bobbin case, and I can tug on that top thread. It's going to bring up a loop. That's my bobbin thread. I tuck both of them underneath that foot and just get that position nicely. Okay. So I've got this line marked and I can see it really clearly. Make sure to watch the other video about quilt marking so you can see how I mark these lines. And now it's just a matter of stitching right down the length of the quilt. So really, this is not hard in any technical way. The trick is just making sure that the quilt is gonna move and it's gonna feed evenly forward. So that's really the only tricky bit. So I just want to stop about every square. I'm going from corner to corner on these squares. So I'm going to stop about every square and just check in on the quilt, make sure that it's not getting hung up by anything, like the edge of my table. It's kind of flopping off the edge of the table here. I could roll it, and then now I'll be up on top of the table instead. That's a little bit better. And I'm also feeling the quilt. You know, with my fingers, I'm feeling those layers. You know, with this Supreme slider on the surface, that could curl up, that could roll. And a good idea, I highly recommend actually taping that thing down until you get used to using it. So that's something to definitely think about. Tape that down if you're not used to using it. So I'm also feeling for like the edge of the quilt. The quilt itself can curl up and roll underneath you too. So all of that you want to be feeling for. And then also just observant, you know, as I'm watching the quilt being fed through, I want to make sure that it's going evenly, it's not getting hung up by anything. I should be able to take my hands off the quilt completely, and the walking foot and the feed dogs do the work of feeding it forward. But it's kind of nice to have your hands on the quilt. I don't know about you, but it just it makes me a little anxious when I take my hands off of it like that. There we go. And this is going to go really quickly. I do think it's okay to go on ahead and knock out an entire color of thread at one time. So I'm going to switch. Once I finish this red line, I am going to go and hit all of the lines of red and stitch through all of those squares. And I'm not going to change thread color until I get all of those knocked out. I just think that's the most efficient way to knock it out. Although that will not be quilting directly from the center, you know, we're going to be kind of bouncing around. And I think that's okay. You know, it's always one of those things. As long as we are consistently quilting it, I think it's going to be just fine. And the other thing about it is we're not quilting this quilt super, super densely. So I think it's a-okay to knock out all of these lines of red first. So I'm going to stitch straight off into the batting just a bit here. And I do this for two reasons. Number one, it extends down and makes sure that we secure that outer edge of the quilt. And then it also allows me to just clip off those thread tails nice and close so I don't have to tie off and bury them if I stop stitching closer up. So let's slide the quilt all the way back into the machine, and we're back at where we started. And this is the thing that does get a little slow whenever we're quilting from the center. We have to tie off this thread tail before we pull up and start the next line of quilting. And I just like to do this because I really hate it when I have all four threads kind of clumped together in one place. It just makes it a pain to figure out what thread goes to what, and you always want to tie off and bury two threads together. You don't ever want to tie off all four threads together at once. I'm going to flip up the quilt, make sure my needle's not coming out the back. It looks good. Now, as far as this method, this technique for hiding your thread tails, I have another video on this, a tutorial. It's really detailed. I go into all of the steps, so make sure to watch that. I will link it up in our quilting tutorial so you can easily find it, and that will guide you on that technique on how to hide your thread tails and bury them. And as you can see, that went really, really quickly. It's not a pain. It's not a, hardship to tie off and bury your threads properly. There we go. So I just did a little rotation. So now I'm facing the other way. And now I can pull up my thread going in this direction. And this is one of those things that I get a lot of questions about. Why don't I just build up my thread in place? Why don't I just, stitch in one place, maybe lower my stitch length down to 0 and just kind of build up a little glob of threads there and that be my way of securing them. And the reason I don't do that is I don't feel like that's very secure. I'm using isocord thread here. It's kind of slippery. It likes to unpick itself. It likes to slip out of knots. So I find that building up thread, that glob of thread method, just really doesn't work very well when working with this thread. And then it's also, it's one of those things. It's taking just a little extra time to create your quilt. It's putting a little bit more pride in your work. And then that's also something that quilt judges do look for. They will run their hand over your quilt and be feeling for knots. They're feeling for lumps and bumps because, in a historical standpoint, tying off and burying your threads as a hand quilter was seen as a really important skill because otherwise your quilting could come undone. It could unravel. So I think it's a really important step to take, and I always keep my cheater needle handy here on a pin place. It's right here on the top of my machine, so I never lose it. And it's always handy, so I can just grab it, tie my thread tails in a knot, and bury them. Okay, so I've got a little bit more bulk here in the arm of the machine, but you can see it's sliding in pretty easily. It's not being a problem. It's still just a matter of stop and check in. Quilt a bit. Stop with your needle in the down position. That's important because if my needle was up and I started shifting around on the quilt, even though the walking foot is putting nice pressure on the quilt, it still has a chance of slipping away, and then I'd end up with a really big weird stitch when I took my next stitch. So that's something to watch out for. Always end with your needle in the down position. And yes, you can get in the habit of just turning your hand wheel. If you don't have an automatic needle down, I've had machines like that. Actually, one of the first machines I ever started with was the Bernina 830, the record 830, the old one, and it did not have an automatic needle down. So every time I wanted my needle in the down position, I had to go and turn it with a hand wheel, and I got used to that, and it wasn't a big deal. Just always stop and rotate that wheel until the needle was down, and then I could get back to stitching. So this line of quilting was really quick. And I'm just coming here right to the edge and stitching these last few lines. And what's really nice about having the pin mores for basting on this quilt is they're just so easy to pull out. I come right up to it and just pull on that end, and that just tugs right out. It's not a big deal. It doesn't get caught up around the foot. You just have to watch out for those flower heads. Sometimes you can hit them a little bit with the foot. You just want to watch out for them. So that one's going to get a little closer. I'm going to go ahead and pull that one out too. There we go. And then again, stitch into that batting a good ways. I'm going to go about 1 inch or so into that batting area, then lift the foot and clip off those thread tails. And we're going to secure the edge of the quilt. When we go around for binding, we do a victory lap stitching that goes around this edge, and that really locks it in place and secures it so we can trim off the edge of the quilt, and it's not a big deal. So keep that in mind too. All right, so now we're going to shift back into the quilt, into the machine, going right back in. I've got this other line of red here. So I'm just going to stitch one line of red, then immediately look for my next line of red, and it looks like it's right here. And you can see in this situation, I've got a lot of quilt here in the machine. This is more than half the quilt in this situation. That's okay. Just kind of cram it in there. You can kind of see it's an accordion pleat back and forth on itself. I didn't roll it. It's just kind of squashed back in there into the arm of the machine. That works just fine. I'm going to pop the quilt up here, all this extra baggy stuff, I'm popping it up so it's not hanging down the edge of the table and pulling against the machine. I want it to be able to feed evenly. So there we go. Everything looks good. And you can see my arms are kind of popped up here. They're winging up. The bulk of the quilt is here. It's kind of, there's only a little bit that I can see here on the quilt. But guess what? It's only going to last for about 1 minute until I stitch out from the center and off the edge of the batting. So it's very short term. It doesn't take a lot of time. It feels a little overwhelming for a little bit, but it's not going to feel that way forever. Whenever I'm working on a big quilt and I'm knocking out that center section, it kind of feels like, wearing a really thick, heavy jacket. I'm kind of bundled up with it. And then as soon as I get out of that section, it's such a relief. It's like, oh, okay, it's, the hard part's done, it's over, and everything gets easier from there. Okay, we're coming up on another edge. You see how fast that went? Like I said, less than a minute. The quilt was bunchy. It was kind of in my way. It felt a little challenging, but then I kept on quilting, got through that area, and now I'm done. Stitch off the edge, lift the needle, lift the foot to take the tension off the thread, and just clip those thread tails. There we go. That's looking great. Now we'll rotate. And this line, this opposite side of that line, will feel so much easier because, look, I've only got this tiny little corner in the machine this time. So that's something else to keep in mind. When one side of the line is going to feel challenging, the other side of the line is probably going to feel just a little bit easier. So here I'm going to tie off and bury this again with a cheater needle. I tie those thread tails in an overhand knot real quick. Grab a cheater needle, run it through the quilt. And it's nice if you can run it through long enough where another line of stitching is going to overlap it. That's not required. It's just one of those nice things that can, if you can plan it, then it's nice to have that happen, but it's not a requirement. I think that that's going to be nice and secure and locked in the quilt. And I just give it a little tug to make sure that knot pops into the middle, into the batting area. And now I can start my next line of stitching. So just drop my foot, drop the needle down, bring it back up again, pull those thread tails to the surface. So much of these little things, tying off my thread tails, bringing my bobbin thread up, so much of that has become a routine and a habit for me that I don't even think about it. It's just really quick and simple. Now, why do we not leave the bobbin thread on the back of the quilt? You might be wondering about that. Well, it's usually really ugly. If you leave the bobbin thread on the back, then you're going to end up stitching over it, and it's going to end up being this kind of weird tail looking thing, and then you'll have to pick it out in order to deal with it later. So I'm always getting asked, what does the back of the quilt look like? So here you can see that red line of stitching already coming in on. I think that's going to look great once all of the different colors are in place. Once we have the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple, I think that's going to look really cool on top of that blue fabric. But that's just my opinion. And you might want to pick a backing fabric that blends better with these colors. You might want to look around and see if there's some red backing fabric or a black. A black would look really cool because then all of those colors would contrast nicely and you'd be able to see your quilting really nicely. Now, if you have a contrasting back, then that means that you need to really focus on your quilting quality. So if you hear a bad noise, if you hear a grindy, crunchy, bad, awful sound, then that means that you probably broken thread. There's probably a bird's nest on the back and you're gonna need to stop and pick that out and deal with it. I know when I first started quilting, and for a few years there, whenever I would hear a bad sound, I would kind of hesitate a little bit, and then I'd press my foot on the foot pedal and be like, well, if it continues to stitch, I don't have to stop. And I'd keep on going, only to find out later that, I would usually have this nasty knot of thread on the back. But I would always keep on pushing to see if I could keep on going. And if the thread didn't, if the thread didn't come loose and it didn't stop stitching, then I would keep on going. And it took practice and habit more than anything else to get into the mode of flipping the quilt over and taking a look whenever I heard a bad noise like that. Okay, got one more line of red, and I think that whenever you get down, I'm gonna rotate all the way around here, there we go. I think when you get down to this section and you're in the corner, I think you could probably stitch that from edge to edge. I don't think that's that big of a deal once you get into something, you know, that short. This can be a little tricky when you're stitching off the quilt, onto the quilt, then back off the quilt again. It's especially tricky because when you're starting in the batting, then you can kind of push down on the quilt top and create a ripple. So we have to be real careful. First off, make sure that your quilt is nicely basted and secured, and then we're aiming for that line that's marked. Just aim right for it, and then make sure everything stays nice and flat. So yes, you can do it that way. If you're looking at your quilt going, well, that's a short little segment, can I just get away with starting in the batting and stitching onto the quilt? And yes, I think when it's a short enough segment, I think that's okay. Now, through the middle of the quilt, I don't think that's okay, because if you're starting up here and your quilt, you know, might be a little bit of extra puddly fabric or something, you're going to be pushing it like a snowplow all the way down. And that's a problem. So I would only start on the edge of the quilt and quilt in if it's a short enough segment. If it's only a couple, maybe less, let's put a rule on it. Let's say less than 20 inches long. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. So you can see this is a little faster because of course I can knock this line out all in one go. Just one single line all the way across the quilt. So it certainly is faster. The thing to just watch out for is the fabric shifting, anything going wiggly or bubbly on you. If you start to see a pile of extra fabric here in front of the foot, that's called a snow pile. You want to watch out for those because that can lead to pleats, or it can lead to just kind of ripply fabric. We call that whiskering. It could lead to ripply whiskering fabric on the surface too. So that's something to watch out for as well. There we go. So there we go. In like 10 minutes, we have knocked out all of the red, and that is all of the red stitched, and then it's only going to take that much time or less to stitch all of the different colors just exactly the same way. So I'm going to turn off the camera and I'm going to keep quilting. I'm going to change my thread color. I'm going to knock out all these lines, and I'm going to meet you back here and show you what this looks like on the front and back of the quilt when I get all of my lines quilted. So I am quilting my last line. I went on ahead and stitched through all of the different colors and then switched to white thread, and I'm stitching the white thread that's on either side of this black background. So we have the matrix marked here in the center, and then I have two lines on either side of it marked for white thread, and that way I can quilt this design here and have kind of a white outline on either side. I just think that looks really nice. So I'm just stitching from the center. I've already stitched the other half of the line, and this is the last one. And just going off of time, I just turned off the camera and sat here and put myself in jail and stitched the entire thing. This took about an hour and a half to stitch all of those lines, working from the center, breaking thread, tying off the thread tails, changing bobbins, the whole 9 yards of that took about an hour and a half. So it was really not a super time-consuming thing to knock out. And there we go, stitching off into the batting. So there is the last line of stitching done, but I know what you're really excited about seeing is the back of the quilt. So here it is, and I'll bring it close so you can see it. Yes, those colors all contrast, but look at how nicely spaced they are. And I love that look, and I really encourage you to give this a try. Contrast does not have to be scary. Sometimes it can make the quilt beautifully double-sided. It can add a whole totally new element to the quilt itself. I love how this is looking going through that prism area, and I cannot wait to finish this up by quilting the matrix design that we have here in the black background. So that's what we're going to be tackling next week. We're going to quilt matrix in the black background, and that will be our last video finishing up the Prism Path quilt. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot quilting straight lines with me today. Now, if you're just getting started and you'd like to follow along, you can find the quilt pattern for Prism Path in the book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book includes 7 different skill-building quilt patterns to teach you walking foot quilting, as well as 30 beautiful designs to get started with. So I hope that you'll come and check this out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. On my website, I also have a lot of different tools and supplies that can help you out. So all of the tools that I mentioned in this video, the Penmore straight pens, and all the thread colors that I shared, all of that is available at leahday.com/shop. I really hope that you'll come and check it out and help support me creating new videos for you every week. Until next time, let's go quilt.